to Ether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyakin here with a Q&A episode. I know it's been a minute since our last one. We want to try to do these on a monthly, 6-week sort of basis, and it's always great hearing from you guys. And we have a solid amount of questions from the paid supporter audience here. I want to thank everybody for asking the questions, for being a paid supporter. If you want to get behind the paywall and ask us a question in a future Q&A episode, these questions, we try to answer them more extensively, even more extensively than I may answer on my weekly live stream. So we try to give you, your money's worth, try to do some research, make sure we get, the correct answer, actually discuss the topic. That's not to say that we always are prepared to give an extensive answer on every question, but, feel free. You can ask 1, 2, 3, within reason. You can ask a few questions if you get behind the paywall in these, semi-monthly Q&A threads, which again, it's just another perk, as well as all of the Ether Hour episodes that you can get access to at worldwarnow.co, behind that paywall, worldwarnow.substack.com. Monthly or yearly, it saves a little bit more money to do the yearly. It's very, very affordable. So we greatly appreciate all the support, and the questions are from those very supporters. So, everyone in the comments, show appreciation to them as well as not just us. But before we hop into the first questions here from Nicholas, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad. It's very exciting to get into some of these questions, some controversial ones here, some questions which normally we wouldn't really speak about in our World War Now episodes. So as always, these are some of my most favorite episodes because we get to discuss some of these untouched subjects. So let's get into it.
We have question 1 here from Nicholas. He asks, Conrad and Dmitry, I often feel uneasy using the terms left and right when describing politics and social issues. These terms were only born during the French Revolution, i.e. in an environment where the traditional form of rural monarchy was being done away with. Thus, whilst left and right may be able to describe positions in liberal democracies, they seem too often to be inadequate if applied to alternative structures, monarchy, fascism, military dictatorship, etc. If given a binary choice, I may describe myself as on the right, but there are also many on the left who I admire, at least in some regards, as many on the left whom I despise. How do you view these terms? Are they just one of several axial positions one could take? For example, also local versus global, libertarian versus authoritarian, or individual versus collective? Is the left versus right another false dichotomy? Are these terms perhaps beginning to become outdated? Thank you for all the wonderful material you've been publishing lately, both the podcast and the Ritual Regicide and Death of Empire works. Well, thank you so much for your support, Nicholas. You're always asking great questions, and this is a good one. I'll throw it to Dmitry first to get his thoughts.
Of course. I think, firstly, Nicholas, that these terms, the fact that they've begun sort of existing since the French Revolution, they've kind of shown how complex politics has become, especially since the population of the world, in particular the population of Europe, has ballooned and skyrocketed since about the Industrial Revolution, obviously, and you had the whole push for democracy, the push for the involvement of the masses in the political system. And naturally, not all of these trends were good. I think in our assessment, I think would be on the same page here. But these terms generally, I think, are simply used for pragmatic purposes. Utilitarian approach to some of these terminologies will be probably the best way to address the left-right axes. I wouldn't necessarily stop using them simply because they're hyper abused today. For example, a lot of people get mixed up with the issue because in politics and in culture, left and right wing means one thing, but in economics, it means almost an entirely another thing. For example, left wing in economics is more authoritarian based, obviously more socialistic, and the right wing clearly is more related to libertarianism. So clearly, I think there's obviously a lot of people who are confused about the subject in the first instance. And yet they also believe that left wing, for example, the state being involved in economics is inherently bad because it comes from, say, the USSR, or it's somehow influenced by the Cold War. I think this is an incorrect approach. And honestly, if I'm going to use a historical example, in the Russian Empire, when political parties were first introduced in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and the Russian Duma was instituted in around 1905, 1906, you actually do see Russian Orthodox Christians, including future saints, and even contemporary saints, refer to monarchist parties as right-wing. So I think given that we are in the closest proximity to those pious Orthodox Christians, they are very much our spiritual ancestors, like directly so. Just a little bit over 100 years ago, they've dealt with the political tensions of, the Europe before the revolution, before the world wars. We can clearly, I think, take that inheritance and use it today. And so I think identifying ourselves as right-wing politically is not necessarily a bad thing. We just need to understand that it doesn't necessarily put us on an equal plane as Republicans. It doesn't mean that we are pro-democracy, pro-necessarily American Revolution if we're not Americans. It just means that we are more conservative than those on the left. But these are very vague terms. Similar to international relations, we speak about this a lot in our World War Now episodes. Like, there are more or less three dominant theories in IR, and realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And I would even, most people would say, well, I'm a realist because I'm more right-wing and conservative. And I personally used to think that as well, until recently when I started this podcast. I came to the realization that I'm very much a constructivist, frankly, because I think international relations should more or less come out of a person's ethics and what a person really believes about the world, their moral stance and religion first and foremost, not realist Machiavellian attitudes towards the world. So it's very interesting, but the left-right axes, I think Conrad would agree, we use it today simply for utilitarian purposes out of sheer pragmatism. It doesn't actually define our political ideology as it is.
No, I largely agree there. And I think the only thing I'll say in a supposed, I guess, defense, because I have no interest in really defending the left-right paradigm, but in defense of using it in a utilitarian way, the whole sort of woke thing, and putting aside the silly boomer term wokeness, just the sort of modern libtard, feminist, anti-racist, anti-authoritarian mind virus, sort of having that understood as left and then being against that and being, based as meaning right-wing. I think as much as there is a lot of disagreement on what being based means, but look, being proud of who you are as a white person, being, religiously intolerant, as it were, not wanting to, give everybody, not thinking all religions are equal, I guess, thinking, in rigid and enforced gender roles, believing in those sorts of things. Insofar as right wing can indicate that, I think it can be useful. And I'm not going to just be saying, oh, I'm not right wing, just in a sort of way to coyly try to convince people that I don't think what they normally associate being right wing with meaning, which is, racist, sexist, xenophobic, religious extremist, which, like, if a bunch of libtards wants to think I'm a racist, sexist, xenophobic, religious extremist, let them. I don't care. We're moving on from the name calling. However, that is obviously not what Nicholas is asking. And I agree that outside of the sort of communist fascist dialectic that obviously emerged in the midst of the First and Second World Wars, after the First World War and into the Second, I think that is a bit useful as well. But unfortunately, as I've discussed before, there's sort of a divide in the right wing right now. The notion of a sort of secular right wing, rigid, secular, authoritarian, doctrinaire, right wing sort of party politics akin to what happened in Germany in the 1930s, or on the other side of things in the left with the rigid communist doctrinaire politics and a party taking over. This isn't necessarily the model. That's not to say there can't be a party and that if it succeeds, but it's going to look something more like what Steve Su sees happening in China, not what people want to do to recreate this, this brown shirt thing in the modern time. And I think much like people bemoan that it has to be religious, but fundamentally it is true that once we get a large amount of population Orthodox, or once a country that has a largely Orthodox population emerges and sort of comes into its own as far as its political reality, whether that's Russia restoring the monarchy, Georgia restoring a monarchy, Greece and reclaiming territory and regaining Constantinople, anything like this, or something in America taking over. I'm very skeptical that there's going to be some kind of American political Orthodox takeover. But if you have to move towards that goal, you have to sow the seeds first, which means people have to enter into the institution of righteousness. People can't act politically if they are, broken vessels. You can't have a Christian politique if nobody involved is a true Christian, which means participating in the Orthodox sacraments. So I guess we're sort of moving a bit far afield from the question, but either way, I do think that when it comes to the basic social beliefs that we disagree with people on the quote unquote left, there's no need to shy away from the label, especially if it, stand on your principles. If that means identifying as right in the moment, I guess that is what it is. But yes, I do believe that there is even an option where future right-wing authoritarianism could also be very detrimental to the church and to the world and to people's souls and to all sorts of things. So we obviously need to be very aware of that. But Dimitri, I think you're right as well regarding, Machiavellianism versus, constructivism and whatnot, realism. I think on one hand, it's a tough line to walk, because if you're just a pure, if you're literally just turn the other cheek, full ethics, then you're going to, then you're basically might as well be a monastic and you have to sort of abandon politics. And it's about sort of walking that line between, how do we realistically tread the waters of geopolitics and world diplomacy while also not going so far as to compromise our principles? And that's why you need to have institutions that develop elite human capital. These are questions that only great people, people that are great and have been raised in the church and are trusting in God and have good relationships with Christ and the saints. Those are the types of people that can answer these set of civilizational questions. So we need to build that up before we can even really necessarily consider those things actually happening. Because right now, I would say we have a human capital crisis. And I'm not just talking about demographic change, which is obviously part of it. I'm talking about our country has been secular for a long time, let alone non-Orthodox. So I think we've got a bit of generational XP building to do, as it were, before we can decide we want to have a based government or something like that. But moving on to question 2 here, which is a fantastic question from Sophia. She asks, I would like a bit of insight into why there seem to be 2 camps among Russian clergy, ones that recognize the royal martyrs as martyrs and those who don't. I'm assuming she means the ones that recognize them as passion bearers strictly. It's been quite a shock for me to realize that there's resentment toward Rokor and supporters of the royal family, even going so far as to call them a czar cult. I naively assumed that we were all on the same page. So I think you're the well-equipped person to answer this question, Dimitri.
Yes, I think unfortunately I may be the most equipped person to answer it in the English language as well, which only means that, a lot of information hasn't been really translated from the Russian. And that's unfortunate because this particular issue that Sophia spoke about an entire episode can be dedicated to it, or an entire episode series. It's the issue of, I would say, anti-monarchism and maybe even clericalism. I would refer to it as that, because this kind of lies at the helm of not venerating and not respecting the royal martyrs and their family as martyrs, but as passion bearers, simply because they died for allegedly political reasons. This, of course, lies at the fact that, their canonization in and of itself was a delayed process. Notice they were only canonized even by Rokor in 1981, clearly when, even though they were locally venerated and respected by many Orthodox Christians, including St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco, well and truly before that. So why the delay? And of course, the Moscow Patriarchate canonized them only in the year 2000, and the process commenced in 1998 and 1999. You can still find actually the debates on YouTube. There's about 4 hours in Russian of debates about whether or not they should be canonized in the official Russian church. And that debate is probably one of the hardest things to watch, because you actually see Orthodox Christian. These are seminary teachers, professors of Orthodox Christian history and canon law from, let's just call it what it is, no pun intended, coming from a left-wing perspective, claiming that the royal martyrs are not supposed to be canonized because, say, Tsar Nicholas II was a smoker, right? And we know, St. John of Kronstadt smoked for a large period of his life. We know that now. And I think, generally speaking, there was plenty of saints that smoked in the 19th century before it was overall condemned by the church. But just these sort of nitpicking issues aside, the main reason I think why they aren't respected as much as they should be is primarily stems from the 1917 revolution and the fact that a lot of members of the high clergy participated in the revolution and kind of did not oppose the overthrow of the monarchy in February, March of 1917. That is when the provisional Freemasonic government took over Russia before the Bolsheviks came to power, which is what the documentary from Metropolitan Tikhon, which we have published on the Substack blog, covers very in depth. But he sort of touches on the issue of the hierarchs, not supporting the Tsar. But I think it goes a bit further than that. You have to understand that out of the 3 candidates for the Patriarchate in November of 1917, when the Patriarchate was restored, Archbishop Anthony Khrapovitsky, the future leader of Rokor, Metropolitan Tikhon, right, obviously future Patriarch Tikhon Belavin, and obviously for Americans, he is a very venerated saint as well, because he was one of the foundational bishops who set up the American diocese. And you had Metropolitan Arseny Stadnitsky, who isn't a saint in the church, but he was a very charismatic Orthodox Christian bishop. All 3 of these bishops did not speak out in favor of the monarchy when the revolution took place. In fact, many of them were directly opposed. Like Arseny Stadnitsky famously proclaimed, the will of God has been done. God has blessed Russia, has removed the Tsar Nicholas II from power. And many of our most respected new martyrs, unfortunately, participated in this passionate revolutionary push towards liberalism in March of 1917. And then, of course, many of them repented, especially before their martyrdom. This is very clear from Metropolitan Anthony Khrapovitsky, right, the future hierarch of Rokor, who very obviously began to transform his internal views. And it's weird seeing somebody over the age of 65 change and improve his political ideology based on the realities he sees on the ground. But how exactly did this evolve, this idea of clericalism and anti-monarchism? It transferred, unfortunately, from Patriarch Tikhon, who also had this massive red-pilling moment. Literally, as he was being detained by the Bolsheviks, his attitude towards Tsar Nicholas II began improving. Unfortunately, after the Tsar was already martyred in the basement of the Ipatiev house and in Yekaterinburg, but still, it did improve and changed. But because of the Bolshevik occupation of Russia and the ensuing Sergianism, the attitude towards Tsar Nicholas II, of course, went extremely downhill from there. The only people who held any sort of monarchist or pro-Tsar Nicholas II ideas or venerated him broadly were the laity and certain members of the monastic community, many elders of the Russian Orthodox Church, and those abroad in Rokor, fortunately enough, also promoted this idea. So it's only because of these three groups is why we have such broad veneration today. And that's, we should be very thankful to these particular groups for that. But today, unfortunately, you still have these leftovers, and they're pushed by many prominent, and even certain priests who are recently deceased. For example, the martyred Father Daniel Sisoyev, one of his worst ideas by far. And this is why many people even oppose his canonization, despite the fact that he was martyred by a Muslim in 2009, is the fact that he openly attacked and slandered Tsar Nicholas II. He said that he shouldn't be canonized as a martyr. He's simply a passion bearer, etc. Completely inappropriate. He had very wrong political beliefs, despite the fact that he was one of the best anti-Islamic apologists of the 21st century, like to date in Russia. So generally speaking, this idea of the royal martyrs being politically executed by the Bolsheviks, it comes from a place of uneducatedness, first and foremost. So many of members of the laity and clergy simply haven't read the materials, right? They're not interested in approaching them. And secondly, it comes from these presuppositions which are liberal in nature, and they stem from the beginnings of the Russian Revolution. It's very hard for people to go back in time and to say that a lot of these hierarchs who supported the revolution were wrong in their approach. And nevertheless, we have many saints in Orthodox Christian history who are incorrect in some of their even theological opinions back in the day, especially in the first 1,000 years of the church. But they were either corrected later on or they repented for their issues. So I think the approach here needs to be very charitable, Sophia. However, today, and Conrad can probably speak to this, the leftovers and the baggage from that Soviet Sergianist period of nobody really knowing the truth about Tsar Nicholas II is carried over into essentially pure ignorance. Like people saying that the rank of passion bearer, for example, is somewhat unrelated to martyrdom, even though the term passion bearer in the first 1,000 years of the church was such a high title. It was only dedicated to two particular figures in the church, that is, our Lord Jesus Christ himself and Mary, the Mother of God, the Theotokos. In the church hymns, they're the only two figures who are called passion bearers in the first 1,000 years. And only after Saints Boris and Gleb, the children of Saint Vladimir of Kiev and the grandchildren of Saint Olga of Kiev, were canonized as passion bearers by the Russians, by the way, and somewhat willfully, because the Greeks and the Byzantine Romans, they were a little bit taken aback as to why the Russians are canonizing two Orthodox Christian princes as passion bearers. They were a bit surprised by this. Nevertheless, passion bearers, the title itself was always associated with martyrdom. I don't think it's wrong calling the royal martyrs both martyrs and passion bearers together. Maybe in a future episode we can discuss the term passion bearers and what it actually means, the significance behind it. But generally speaking, unfortunately, certain members in the church today, they use the term passion bearers strictly in relation to a form of secular martyrdom, perhaps political execution, or just murder outright, which is not what happened to the royal martyrs. We know, because imagine if you applied the same rules to a lot of the clergy and hierarchs who were shot for political motivated reasons by the Bolsheviks, including, of course, the Patriarch Tikhon himself, who was imprisoned and he later died from health complications due to, well, according to the Bolsheviks, due to his political opposition to the Communist Party. So it's a really deep rabbit hole, but generally speaking, I think it's because Russians are still getting red-pilled. They're still waking up to the question of who the royal martyrs were, who was Tsar Nicholas and his significance to the church, his importance, and how we should venerate him properly.
Yes, while I'm obviously not at the same level of educated as Dmitry on the depths of this subject, I did go to Russia and talk to a lot of people that believe this. I've read my fair share of books on the Romanovs and their martyrdom and whatnot. And not only is there this distinction in and of itself, but there's then even the distinction of, those who believe they're martyrs, they'll call them that, but then they don't believe they were ritually murdered, for example. They won't believe that there was a ritual element to the regicide, which is a big, I was made aware of that distinction within Russian and right-wing monarchist circles in Russia when I went there. There are those who they have read the material that our ritual regicide series is based off of. These are scholars, monks, priests, even bishops. Metropolitan Tikhon expressed sympathy towards the idea, but unfortunately, for example, we tried to have our ritual regicide series, sort of investigated by the Moscow Patriarchate, and they simply responded with we reject the theory that there was a ritual regicide after our investigation. Look at the investigation yourself. This is what we think happened. That was sort of the response. It wasn't like it was super angry, but it's clear that this is not the official position that the MP wants to put out right now, despite the fact that it is the true position. So we do have to have sympathy sometimes with those who protest against, these sorts of intra-Orthodox issues that don't stem to the realm of, dogmatic disputes. So I think that is where we are with that, because again, the martyrdom passion bearer thing, Dmitry laid that out well, but then the ritual nature of the regicide, I think if you don't add that angle, it sort of ruins the argument for their martyrdom, because it was a civilizational conflict. Those who consider Christ and his church to be their enemies killed the emperor and his family with that as their goal. And sure, I guess you could say that you don't need the ritual element for that to happen, but without the Jewish element to it, it's sort of hard to make that case that it wasn't strictly political, which we obviously know that it wasn't. It was a cosmically significant event. So that's my take on that. If you have any final thoughts, Dmitry, you can let me know before we move on to Paisios' question.
No, that's entirely accurate. Exactly. There's layers to this. And of course, the ritual murder angle that's the last step Orthodox Christians really need to analyze before they can get sort of the full picture. And frankly, all of the initial, if you look at the minutes of the council of 1981, they discussed the ritual murder sort of in depth at that council when the royal martyrs are canonized. So it's not like we're simply pulling this information out of the ether and conjuring it up. No, this is actually the information on the ground. But next question from Paisios. I have a few questions. You guys don't need to answer all of them. But here we go. First, do you believe Fyodor Dostoevsky is a saint? The more I read about his life, the more I'm convinced of his sainthood. Even when he was poor, he gave generously, and some elders say he had the gift of prophecy. It's said that he received the Eucharist on his deathbed and while hearing the parable of the prodigal son, and died with a smile on his face. I'd love to hear your view on whether he might be glorified one day. Amazing question, but let me just address this one first and foremost. I think there's a potential. I definitely first and foremost think that Fyodor Dostoevsky is in heaven. As far as we can see from his life, from what we know, and so much has been published, many people knew him personally in the 19th century, including his second wife, Anna Dostoevskaya. She lived on literally until the revolution, 1918. He loved her dearly. And despite his tumultuous early life, right, and no pun intended, but Dostoevsky's early life was that of essentially a criminal. But so were the lives of many other people in the 19th century, especially during that industrialization period. A lot of young men underwent this revolutionary fervor, and then they repented from it, and they came to Christ. His story is that, essentially. And it really is that. That's probably why he listened to that prodigal son story, because that is his parable. And not just him, but in the recent article we published on the World War Now Substack, Shekinah's Chariot, we quote from Lev Tikhomirov. And if you read about Lev Tikhomirov, the Russian historian and a big monarchist political thinker, he wrote more about politics than Fyodor Dostoevsky did. He wrote mainly nonfiction works and about the history of religion. Lev Tikhomirov had exactly the same history. In fact, he was even bigger of a revolutionary, and I would even say borderline terrorist, before he came to the faith and became a big-time monarchist. Like, he was actually like a socialist. He wanted to overthrow the Tsar and whatever in the 19th century, so it was quite bad. In fact, he was somewhat even related to the murderers of Alexander II, which is quite horrible. But generally speaking, I think before we don't necessarily even need to move towards a canonization of Dostoevsky. I think there's many other saints in the church right now. Like, the waiting list is so full, the queue, that I think even the canonization of Generalissimo Alexander Suvorov may be a bit too hasty. Like, we need to allow people to come towards veneration more organically rather than forcing the issue top down. And this is really important because we have such a long list of potential saints, especially in the Russian Orthodox Church, locally speaking. So I think Fyodor Dostoevsky, I think he personally would be fine sort of waiting in the queue a little bit further down. And generally, everyone who is Orthodox or even Christian of any denomination respects and appreciates his works, just how Christian they are, irrespective of his status as a canonized saint or just the regular Orthodox Christian pious layperson. So I think it's just unnecessary, but there is a possibility, there's a non-zero chance that he is a saint in heaven, absolutely. Except I just don't see a benefit for us to push a canonization of him. I'm more of a believer in like a bottom-up organic process.
Yes, and I know pretty much the basics about Dostoevsky's life. He was struggling with gambling up even to the very end and some of these other things. So obviously there'd be some things that would warrant investigation potentially more than others. And that's probably the case in general with lay saints, people that don't live in monasteries or live as priests. There's going to be a bit more of an investigation, I guess, into their lives. But again, the story of his repentance, him sort of moving from socialist revolutionary to more of a monarchist, that is, I think, a very important story on top of obviously him being considered the greatest novelist in world history. But I think more than that, this is an example, like Dimitri said, where I think if God wanted this to happen, there would be some miracles, right? There would be some appearances, there would be some miraculous events, there would be some signs that would make it clear that this is what the church needs to do. So like you said, Dimitri, this is one of those things where I think you got to trust the Holy Spirit on as we do in the church. Again, we don't force these things, but that doesn't mean that we just do nothing. Obviously, we are the limbs of Christ. The church is the body of Christ. So we obviously carry out his acts on earth and work out our salvations with fear and trembling in tandem with him. But with these sorts of things, we obviously need to, there have been many visions and miracles and miracle working icons even of the royal martyrs and the Tsar and his family that we discussed earlier. So that of sorts is happening organically. And if it's meant to happen for Dostoevsky, it definitely will. We just got to trust God. But great question, Paisios. He goes on to say, I also wanted to suggest some guests I'd love to see on your show, especially David Irving. His work on World War II and Hitler is unmatched, based on firsthand interviews and took decades to complete. He suffered greatly for it, including prison and threats to his family. He's still alive and writing, though elderly, and I think a conversation with him, especially one that introduces orthodoxy, would be incredible, which I think that would be great. Unfortunately, David Irving is so old, I can't imagine he's still doing podcast interview appearances. If he was, that would be wonderful. I've had him on my list of potential Ether Hour episodes since I started Ether Hour, so that is obviously big. I need to read more of his work. I've read large sections of it, but I've never actually bought the books. They were so expensive on the internet for a while. I was only reading PDFs, so I do need to dive more into David Irving, but having him on would be a fantastic, he'd be the only person I'd have on that I'd be willing to just do a show about World War II as a more general topic, because I'm not prepared to handle that just as my little old self. But yes, we got to pray for David Irving, pray for his health. If he sort of makes a bit of a small recovery where he's more healthy a bit before, he exits this mortal coil, that would be someone we would definitely love to have on the show.
No, absolutely. I completely can sign my name on everything you've said, Conrad. And yes, even though he's elderly, maybe potentially we can reach out, write an email to him. However, he is incredibly popular, and he probably already has a huge list of people trying to invite him out for an interview. In any case, maybe in the future we can discuss his particular books and works and what kind of contribution he's brought up to European history, because World War II is one of those most slandered and lied about subjects, I think, today. And really, we haven't had a proper episode dedicated to that period of time and that particular event for a good reason. It's because so much research needs to go into it. Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Paisios. And the next one. Also, do you think AI will survive the coming war? I doubt it. The saints mention radios and television, but never AI. I think it'll fade with the collapse of modernity. AI, absolutely. I think AI is here to stay. AI is simply an aspect of automation, which we've seen in factories and since the Industrial Revolution, machines doing a lot of human labor work. AI will simply always be with us. I don't think AI will ever reach consciousness or this sort of singularity point. And unfortunately, I think given that we're communicating with you at the moment through the internet, through the ether waves, clearly, as long as this podcast is around, AI will also exist. AI is here helping us edit these episodes, helping us record more or less in a very, shall we say, basic, fundamental way. Unfortunately, I think given the saint's ability to foretell the future through clairvoyance, not everything is, of course, revealed to us. So absolutely, I think AI is here to stay. It's a Pandora's box which we've opened as humans. And the fact that Orthodox Christians are not in charge of the process is probably the most concerning thing for me. So whether or not future Christian majority states pass some sort of limiting legislation, I think this will be one of the biggest aspects which really affect where exactly AI goes in terms of its development. But yeah, I think AI is not going to leave us as long as we're on the internet, as long as we have the same level of technological progress. I think it's here to stay.
I remain hopeful. I mean, maybe not confident, but it would be amazing if an EMP could just wipe out all electricity and technology and we could just return to like hunter-gatherer, agrarian monkey society. I think that would save a lot of people's souls. But unfortunately, I mean, we're getting into the realm of like biocomputers and like wet computers and this weird type of organic technology hybrid. Unfortunately, I don't think we're putting the cat back in the bag on this one, or closing Pandora's box, whatever out of control analogy you would like to use. But if the war could potentially slow down some of these technological developments that will enslave us, that will be a big benefit. Paisios also asks, I'd also love to see you talk with Nicholas J. Fuentes. He's gaining momentum again, and I think now is the perfect time for him to hear about Orthodox prophecy. Reaching out to him could have a big impact. Well, obviously, we'd love to talk to Nick. I don't know how much we talked to him about prophecy. People have, super chatted him about the prophecies before, which, let's put it this way, guys. You definitely, unless you're going to send him a lot of money, do not super chat Nick about like orthodoxy, about prophecies, about these sorts of things. He's just going to make fun of you. Like, he's Catholic. He's not going on the show to like seriously engage with what these super chatters say, what these super chatters' opinions are. If you want to have him take a question seriously, you clearly have to give at least $100, if not way more than that. So people have asked him about the prophecies. People have said, the Elder Theodore prophecies, and he said, I've heard him say it. He said, anyone could have predicted that. That's silly. Like, why are you even asking me about that? So it's not like his thing per se. And I think if we had him on, it would have to be under, the correct circumstances. Because again, I'm sure a lot of people want to have him on the show. He only really goes on shows that are going to actually give him an audience boost, which pretty sure everybody that listens to our show is probably familiar with Nick Fuentes. Maybe not, but we can grow enough to where eventually we have a big enough Orthodox audience to where he thinks it's worth coming on an Orthodox show. But besides that, if we talk to him, it would obviously have to be political. And maybe I think it'd be interesting to have a political religious conversation, like about the political implications of Orthodoxy versus Catholicism, some of the realities on the ground. But he's not super interested in that. He's not a Catholic apologist, and he's soured on Jay and some of these things since more and more people have been asking and these things have surfaced. So people got to take it easy. Don't try to overwhelm somebody. It's not like Nick is likely to become Orthodox at all. I mean, he was born Catholic. He read the Bible. He's not super convicted about most particularities of the Catholic faith. He's a very simple Novus Ordo Catholic. So it's going to take a lot more than just convincing him of the arguments of Orthodoxy. He's going to have a bit of an epiphany on the importance of civilizational Christianity and how important the life of the church actually has to be in one's life, and that you can't sort of just have a normal one and go to church on Sunday. That's not to poo-poo his faith. I think he is a real Catholic. He prays and goes to church, but the Novus Ordo lifestyle that most Catholic priests tell people is fine to live isn't exactly, I don't think it's the exact, it's not the spiritual barracks that we need people to be enlisted in right now in the warfare that we're currently in. But quick thoughts on that, Dimitri?
No, I exactly agree. I think if we ever grew to a size wherein we could actually collaborate with him, and maybe he'd be open to discussing this issue with us in like a long form type of podcast, absolutely, we'd love to have him on. But I think at the moment he is very much in the realm of Roman Catholicism only, and he's not very much open to the discussion of Orthodoxy, especially how it could impact American politics. I think is very much locked into American domestic politics, how he can change it, impact it for the better. And notice he doesn't even discuss the new Pope too much. And that's because clearly Roman Catholicism has that aspect of potentially even undermining his own political views from the inside. So even for himself at the moment, he's just in this really dangerous time where everybody's trying to take him out. And I think he really doesn't, unfortunately for him, even though, we'd probably argue the spiritual journey needs to come first, we can clearly see he's not focused on that aspect of life as much as probably he should be. So I completely agree with Conrad. And the last question from Paisios: do you believe you'll have the privilege of seeing St. John III Vatatsis before his glorious resurrection? I was rewatching your old episodes and heard you and Gregory speak of people you've met who have seen him, and it made me wonder if that grace might be given to you guys as well. Thank you for everything and have a great day. It's a very humbling question. It would be amazing to witness some of those eschatological events come to fruition and seeing St. John III awaken from his slumber. Whether or not I'd be willing to even come close to the emperor in person, of course, we have to just appreciate that during the time of St. John Vatatsis, when you would come into the presence of the Byzantine Roman emperor, you would need to fall down into a prostration right away. I don't think we, unfortunately, in this modern world even know how to behave and how to conduct ourselves in front of an Orthodox Christian emperor, let alone somebody who has been asleep for over 800 years. I mean, this is maybe even a good pretext, people witnessing St. John III in person for however many years he will reign over the newly restored Greek kingdom, or maybe even the broader Orthodox Christian empire united with Russia potentially in the future. It's a good preparation for Orthodox Christians to accept and prepare for other saints who will return. For example, the prophet Elijah or the forefather Enoch from the Old Testament, from the book of Genesis. So in some ways, perhaps St. John III Vatatzis, as shocking as it will be, it'll be preparation for us Orthodox Christians, and it'll teach us how to regain that reverence that our ancestors, spiritually speaking, at one point had. But of course, I'd be absolutely honored and humbled to meet an emperor in the flesh, and especially one which we've been reading about and praying to for so long at this point. I mean, what can we really say here? We are not worthy.
Fantastic answer, Dimitri, and fantastic question, Paisios. I mean, that's like the question, right? That's the world worn out question. And I guess it begs the question of, how will his appearance really be, right? And we talked about this with Eschaton Vigil. Will it even be a public thing that this man, this glorious, emperor who has been preserved, his relics, preserved like he was a statue, like he was just asleep? Will it be known to the public that he is John Vatatzis, the Marble Emperor, the Emperor of Nicaea, or will he be a simple Giannis or a man named Giannis with supernatural abilities in some capacity who rises and, does what needs to be done in a brief period of time. And only those with, who have been prepared are really aware of this. I'm convinced of all sorts of options that could happen. Could it be somebody who consorts with St. John and is one of his spiritual children that ultimately leads the mantle? And then St. John ultimately comes out, near the end, revealing himself. I think there's a lot of possibilities here. And I'm very much open. And I lean more towards the idea that he will emerge, frankly, in his Byzantine imperial wear, and that will be very much known. That might be the maximalist interpretation, but that's sort of what I'm thinking. And as far as the time frame, I mean, obviously I have no idea. It would be incredible if it were to happen. I personally believe it probably won't be till maybe after this generation has passed away. I do see things potentially getting worse before they get better in certain ways. So again, we don't really know. However, based on the strikes, the fulfillment of these recent prophecies, it's very likely, I would say, not unlikely, that it very much could come to pass in our lifetimes, even more before I'm even a super old man, potentially. So that is one thought about things. And I mean, in many ways, as much as I'm giving everything away and it's over after I say this, this whole show is effectively my audition tape, my interview for being the emperor's top guy. Like when that happens, I'm sure I need to, I'm going to get so much trouble for saying this, but I will be the Goebbels to St. John's Hitler. I will propagate the message of the restored empire. I will do whatever I can to spread the true message of orthodoxy and the true message of Jesus Christ and his church across the world at any personal cost, to the very end, to the bunker, till the Antichrist kills him. And kills me potentially if I'm there by his side. I would be there. But of course, that's just what I say on my show. In reality, I'm a total worthless guy, and my spiritual life could do a whole lot better. So in reality, I will be nowhere near the vicinity of the emperor, as Dimitri said, and probably wouldn't even know how to act if I was even around one. But, us in the West, we can all LARP, right? I haven't had the joy of being a Greek family dining, I think somewhere near Didymoteko in Greece, and have St. John appear through my walls and tell me that I'm going to be the mayor of a town and all these other people are going to have different jobs in the future empire. I was not. Maybe all of that will simply be relegated to simple Greek villagers and certain army figures and others. But, if this American podcaster is so lucky to see such a thing happen, well, obviously it would be incredible to just be a part of it, to witness it, just let alone be a part of it. So great question, Paisios. We could probably have a whole podcast just LARPing about what we would do in that situation. But I think it's important, and I appreciate the real world worn out patriots that are fully aware of the lore and are always reminding us each episode of what we're really working with here. Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this incredible Ether Hour Q&A. Get on behind that paywall to not only get access to future Ether Hour Q&A threads so we can answer your questions up here, but you also hear the rest of this episode where we discuss neo-paganism, fascist movements in the United States, the World Economic Forum, Agenda 2030. We discuss American prophecies about the West Coast of the United States, California. We talk about Dave Smith. We talk about NATO. We discuss Orthodox France and its history. We talk a lot about some of my experiences with certain bishops, talking to them. We talk about Freemasons and the Kabbalah. We talk about homeschool curriculums, Orthodox schooling curriculums, all sorts of fascinating questions. Rasputin. It's a really good episode. So be sure to get behind that paywall, and we would love to see your questions on our next Q&A. So thank you all so much for listening, and God bless. We will see you on the other side.